So I'm going to say a few words of introduction, kind of set the stage, and then we're going to hear from our speakers. I'm going to ask them one question, they're going to answer that question, and then we turn it over to the discussants, and then we'll go from there, including you. So imagine someone coming up and saying, the Earth is the center of the universe, and the sun, as you can see, revolves around the Earth. We wouldn't pay much attention to it. It would be one seemingly crazy, or just a crazy idea, an idea certainly out of the box, but not worth paying any attention to. When that reverse idea was raised, that is, in the ancient times, going back to Plato, Westerners at any rate, believed that the universe did revolve around the Earth, including the sun. After you wake up in the morning, you see the sun go around, it's very obvious. That was called the Ptolemaic astronomy, that all of the planets and the stars, including the sun, went in circles around the Earth. But if you look at the sky, as people did back then a lot, they would see that the planets went backwards sometimes. And similar to the feeling that people had with Ptolemaic astronomy, it's enough already. I mean, how many epicycles and epicycles do we need before we say there's something fundamentally wrong? We don't know what's right, but there's something fundamentally wrong. And in that kind of a paradigm breakdown moment, whether it's in science or in politics, the kinds of thinking that is generated mostly sounds weird, crazy, unsupportable, and dangerous. Most of it is. But some of it has the ingredients for what the next Copernican idea will be. So it's in that spirit that we're entertaining unorthodox views for the future of a problem that many people, including me, does not think can be thought about usefully under the old paradigm. So with that, I would like to introduce return to our first speaker. He's already been introduced, Rabbi Yehuda.
Thank you. Good evening, thanks for having me, and thank you again to all the important people and groups that Matt mentioned. It's a great honor to be here together with Sami. This is actually the first time we're speaking together in any public forum outside our country. Most of what I do is referred to in Israel as alternative peace activism. And in order to understand this idea of alternative peace activism, one first has to appreciate the fact that peace activism, the idea of being an activist for peace, has come to be synonymous with promoting a two-state solution in Israeli society. And that's what it essentially has come to mean to be a peace activist. So they call us alternative peace activists. And we're really alternative, I think, for three reasons. Number one, we circumvent the international community and the peace industry. As Professor Lustick pointed out, the two-state solution is something that we view as unhelpful, unproductive to this point. In fact, I represent the sector of Israeli society that's been against it from the beginning. And we circumvent all of that. That's one reason why we're alternative. The second reason why we're considered alternative is because we don't believe that peace between Israelis and Palestinians can be achieved by empowering the westernized diplomats from both sides, from Tel Aviv and Ramallah, to get together and sign an American piece of paper. And we believe that the quote-unquote extremists who have been marginalized from the process until now need to be empowered to take leadership roles in creating a different relationship dynamic and creating a new future in the country. And the third reason why we're considered alternative is because we don't believe that peace can be achieved through forcing two sides to compromise on things that are fundamentally important to them. Because if we were to achieve some kind of agreement based on such a compromise, I think that many people on both sides, probably including myself, would just be preparing for the next conflict in order to take what we feel is rightfully ours and is taken away from us. So we believe that peace has to come about through recognizing that Israelis and Palestinians are, for the most part, living in two completely different movies, living in two completely different conflicts. I think most Palestinians are experiencing an anti-colonial struggle, whereas most Israelis are experiencing a struggle between two competing nationalisms. The last 100 years have been very different in our respective stories, two very different narratives. And when I say narrative, I'm really defining a narrative as a collection of facts that are selectively chosen and contextualized within a very specific ideological worldview. I think there are millions of facts when it comes to our conflict. No party is taking all the facts and utilizing all the facts. We're each utilizing the facts that we like, that promote our story, that promote our agenda. And therefore, we're largely talking past one another. We're not even having the same conversation. We're not even sharing the same conflict. And I think there are many negative ramifications to this, one of which is the fact that both Israelis and Palestinians often engage in counterproductive methods of struggle. Even if the goal is victory, we're both fighting our fantasy of the enemy more than the actual other, because we're both superimposing identities, motivations, and ideologies on the other that are not how the other actually experience themselves. So for us to be able to achieve peace, I believe that we need to create a situation in which both Israelis and Palestinians, or at least those on both sides who are fully living the aspirations of their people, quote-unquote extremists, are feeling like winners in their respective movies, in their narrative, based on their grievances and their aspirations. And the goal, of course, would then be to create some kind of single state between the Mediterranean and the Jordan that allows Palestinians and Israelis to both feel like complete winners in the respective narratives we're living in. Right now, we're pretty far away from that, because we're still at the stage where we're just talking past one another, fighting past one another, and engaging in counterproductive policies. But there are stirrings of something new beneath the surface taking place, specifically in the West Bank. I can speak as a representative of the Jewish community in the West Bank, or a Jewish community in the West Bank, that the younger generation is speaking in a very different language than their parents and the politicians. And there's more of a desire to change the role that the Palestinians play in our story and to change the role we play in their story, in order to try and no longer be the antagonist of the other, and to try and create some kind of way forward where we can both be protagonists together. And I imagine people have several questions, but right now I want to give Sami an opportunity to
So good evening. It's really wonderful to be with you, and thank you for the invitation. I want to start by saying that if you asked me 2 years ago, would you sit with a settler in the US and talk about peace publicly, I would have laughed, and then I would have gotten very angry with you for even thinking something like that. But I think we are living in a reality where we both would believe, like many others, that, as Professor Lustick said, a paradigm shift is taking place and needs to take place. And it's not just in the context of Palestine and Israel, but in the context of a region that we live in, where we are all seeing and witnessing not just tremendous violence, death and destruction, but a redrawing of the entire Middle East map. And I think for us, maybe one of the questions, or for me one of the questions, is instead of having the West redraw it again, as they did 100 years ago, what is our role in determining our own future? As Palestinians and Israelis living together, as Jews, Christians, and Muslims who actually have a deep, intimate love to the land that we all call holy. Just to share a little bit of my journey, in 1998 I started this organization called Holy Land Trust. And the reason we started the organization was because we actually believed in the peace that was sold to us. As Palestinians, we were told by our leadership, by the international community, by the Israeli left, that the only peace that you can have is based on a framework called the Oslo Framework that presented us with something called the two-state solution. This was it. And if you believed in peace, this is what you promoted, this is what you engaged in. If you opposed peace, this is what you opposed. And we were told that anybody that opposed that, opposed peace. And we were told that anybody that opposed that, opposed Palestinian nationalism. My identity as a Palestinian was directly linked with my support or lack of support for the Oslo peace process itself. And we fought for this, we negotiated for this, we dialogued for this peace, because it was the only option on the table. In the year 2000, as many of you know, 1999 and the year 2000, that peace process collapsed. And the second intifada, the second uprising, went into effect. A time when there was a lot of violence experienced by both sides towards each other. As an organization, we said, no, we're still for Oslo. And we will do what the negotiators failed to achieve, which is we will resist to achieve that solution. They failed to do it on the table, we will do it through nonviolent resistance and activism. And I was one of many people that protested against this guy next to me, because we were told they are the reason why the peace process failed, they are the obstacle to peace. If you get rid of the settlers, all of a sudden there will be peace, just like the narrative on the other side says, if you get rid of Hamas, all of a sudden there will be peace. And I challenge those who say, if you get rid of something on the other side, there will be peace, because there will always be something on the other side that will not fit, as Yehuda was saying, into my narrative of the other. A few years into our resistance, into our activism, into getting beaten up, arrested, detained, shot at, you name it, by settlers and soldiers alike, we began to really ask the question of what does it really mean to live in peace in this land? And why are we still beating a dead horse called Oslo? What is so powerful about Oslo that, for me, I look at it and I say, Oslo was probably the most negotiated peace process in modern history. More money has been spent in Oslo and for promoting Oslo and for selling Oslo than any other peace process. More books have been written, more negotiations, more to the minute details, and we still fail to achieve. What was missing? What was wrong in that? And I think part of the discussion will be for us to bring out some of our thoughts as to what was missing in Oslo and what we feel needs to be presented so that we can really be able to move in a real understanding of peace and justice and equality in the whole thing.
I'm going to ask a question of the two speakers that will, I think, deepen the discussion and broaden it and give our commentators a little more to talk about with respect to their approaches. Each of the speakers talked about that they have a new way of looking at the problem. And I'm sure most of you are wondering, what is this new way? It sounds like squaring a circle. How are the extremists on each side going to find what they both want in one state? Well, the way I'd like to pose this question is to ask both speakers the same question, which is this. Tell me about how the others, what role they will play in this community. Okay, for Yehuda, it's a community between the river and the sea that will be the realization of settler ideals that he shares in the West Bank. Now, and in that community, there will be a role for Arabs, and they will also be able to achieve their dreams. I need to hear how that can be. And the same, Sami, if you could articulate your vision of the role that Jews will have in the community, I don't say state because I don't know what kind of community you have in mind, that will be established between the river and the sea, and whether and what you think of the role that Yehuda has allocated to Palestinians.
Oh, he doesn't get plugged up.
I realize there needs to be some symmetry there, so yes, he does get a chance. And you get a chance to talk about it.
So I think when I think about Zionism as a kind of particularist, narrow Jewish national movement, I think of it as a successful movement. I think of it as a movement that actually revolutionized the experience of the Jewish people compared to what the Jewish situation was 150 years ago, I don't think it's comparable. But I think that we made a bit of a mess. And we did amazing things. I think we ingathered broken and scattered people back to a country we had been displaced from thousands of years earlier. We revived dead language to everyday use. We liberated our country from British occupation, although we weren't the only people in history to do that. But we also created a terrible situation for other people. And I think now we're living in a post-Zionist reality. I think we've been living in a post-Zionist reality for 50 years, but we just haven't acknowledged it. And we have to figure out, the Jewish people have to figure out what comes next. And I think the Zionism as an ideology does not have the tools to address the challenges confronting our people today. And therefore, I'm playing with an idea that I call Semitism. I don't know if it's really been concretized. But Semitism, where I've arrived so far, is basically about trying to correct the flaws of Zionism while protecting its positive achievements. Essentially, going deeper into the Jewish character of the state, while focusing specifically on what we share in common with our neighbors. Right now, the state of Israel is essentially a European-style nation-state with very hard, shallow Jewish decorations. I think those Jewish decorations are way too Jewish for Palestinians and not Jewish enough for Haredim. I'll use the HaTikva, the national anthem, as a metaphor, maybe. I personally have a very strong emotional connection to that Tikva. I consider it holy. I think it was sanctified by Jewish freedom fighters who sang it on their way to British galleys. Yet at the same time, I realized that it alienates a lot of people. And therefore, I'm open to entertaining the idea of a new national anthem. And I believe that if we come up, I'm not a songwriter, so it won't be me who comes up with a song. But if somebody who is a songwriter were to come up with a song that doesn't need to use the word Jew in the song, yet is expressing such deep, fundamental Jewish values, especially values that are not exclusively Jewish, but actually values that we experience as Jewish because they're so central to us, but they're also shared by Palestinians and maybe other peoples in the Middle East, then that's a song that can simultaneously be more deeply Jewish than the Tikva, yet at the same time more softly Jewish. And that's essentially where I think the state needs to progress at this point. I think the Jewish character of the state needs to be deeper than it is right now, but at the same time softer. So Haredim, who are essentially the fastest growing population between the river and the sea, and that needs to be taken into consideration when we think about demography pertaining to our conflict in the United States. We rarely speak about the demographic dynamics and trajectory of the Jewish population. So the Haredim are the fastest growing population between the river and the sea. Palestinians, national religious, might be second, tied for second, essentially. We're talking about a very different country. And when we speak about solutions, we have to speak about not where the country is right now, but where the country is going to be in 10 years, where the country is going to be in 20 years, and what values are going to be important to us. And I think the answer at this point is to go deeper with the Jewish character in a way that we experience it is undeniably Jewish, yet softer, so anybody who is not Jewish or not looking for a Jewish state doesn't even notice that it's a Jewish state. That means that everybody who lives in the country should really experience it as a democracy where they have full equality. And yet, the Jews who are looking for a Jewish state should really experience the state as the fulfillment of our aspirations for the last couple thousand years. The correction of what the Romans did to us, and really the fulfillment of what we say in our tefillah 3 times a day. In terms of the role of the other, I think that's one of the fundamental questions we need to ask today. Just like what makes a state Jewish? Is it simply some hard, shallow Jewish decorations and a demographic majority? Or is there something deeper? What's the ideal role of a non-Jew in a Jewish society? What responsibility do we have? Instead of talking about our rights to the land, We should be talking about our responsibility to the land. I was recently in a conversation where somebody in the Jewish community here was complaining to me about the education in Palestinian society, in UNRWA schools, and in Cyprus. And I said that, well, if we really believe this to be our land, then we have a responsibility to the people who live there. We have a responsibility to provide education. We have a responsibility to provide healthcare. We have a responsibility to provide the type of life that would make people happy to live in the country. And what I see happening now in a lot of Israel's Jewish population is there are complaints and fingers pointed about what the other side is doing wrong without any taking of responsibility.
If you ask the average Palestinian, one answer they will give to the question is, I'll give the answer first, Jeopardy. We have no problem with Jews. This is something you will hear quite common by Palestinians being said. We have no problem with Jewish life or Jews living in the land. Our problem is not with Judaism. These are very, very common statements that you will hear Palestinians, because part of our inherent culture is the full recognition of the Jewish right to the Holy Land, to be there. This is part of our culture, part of our history, part of our religious beliefs as Muslims and Jews. But very quickly, they will very quickly point out where our problem is. Our problem is with Zionism, that presents itself as a colonialist land grab and dismantlement of the Palestinian population. Our problem is with Jewish Israeli nationalism. And I think one of the problems that we face today is that these three identity groups, Judaism, Zionism, and Jewish nationalism, have been entangled together in one web, where the criticism of one, or pulling on one, all of a sudden pushes the others to come along and join it and defend it. And so this is the criticism where I say where anti-Semitism comes by criticizing any of the three. And I think part of the healing process that needs to happen, or the transformation process that needs to happen, is to begin to untangle that web and to begin to really ask, what does it mean for me as a Palestinian, coming from a Christian background, knowing many Palestinian Muslims are the same thing, to truly honor the inherited right and claim of the Jewish people to the land? And how then does this become a celebration of our diversity instead of a hindrance to me being able to live my life? And I think part of the criticism of Oslo and why this has not happened is because of the fact that we have ignored and neglected these voices from being heard. Voices like Yehuda's and others. And we have labeled, again, these voices as the extreme. We look into Palestinian extremism and we look into Jewish extremism. And we somehow point extremism from the focal point of saying, how does this relate, again, to Oslo? How does this relate to the Oslo peace process? And extremism is those who are moving in different directions from Oslo itself. Instead of asking the question of what does peace look like for these communities, we never ask. How many of you have ever asked a Hamas person, or even a settler, what does real peace look like for them?
There's a story that the Jews living in the West Bank are experiencing. And whether or not we want to argue if that story is a historically factual story or a valid story, it's a story we're psychologically living in, and we have 600,000 people with probably at least another 600,000 supporters. And by next week we might be 650,000 people just because of our birth rates. So whether or not our story is real, our story is important because we're experiencing it and we believe in it and we're willing to kill for it and we're willing to die for it. And that story is basically this. We are proud ancient people specifically from the West Bank, or from Judea. We were unjustly uprooted and displaced from our land by Roman imperialists. We somehow managed to come home after thousands of years against all odds. And now the international community seems determined to uproot us again. And the only thing we can think to do in order to resist this is to populate as much of the West Bank as possible to make it impossible for anybody to move us. That's the best course of action we figured out so far. Now, Palestinians are actually not central to that story. Palestinians are actually very peripheral to that story, which I think at this point in history is good news, because it means that we can define a positive role in that story for Palestinians, and we don't necessarily have to put them in a negative role. They don't have to be in. When we speak about certain things like, different words offend different people, my issue, I don't have a problem saying words like West Bank. There are probably Jewish speakers who get up and say, no, it's Judea and Samaria, please don't say West Bank. I don't have a problem acknowledging things that Israel has done wrong, and things that we have to kind of confront and make good on. I do have a problem with the English word settler and settlement, because I think the connotation of these words is that we are some, European invaders who have no connection to the land and are just like the French in Algeria or like the Americans in Afghanistan. And the truth is, we can have this argument whether or not we're colonialists or indigenous to the land, but at the end of the day, we experience ourselves as indigenous, and we'll fight like we're indigenous. And I think this is part of what happens when we speak about BDS. BDS is a great example, and I think this is happening both ways. I don't think this is exclusively a Palestinian problem. I think Israelis do this just as much. But I just want to point out that BDS is a method of struggle that is actually very effective against colonialism. You make the price of occupation more expensive than the benefits of exploitation. And if you can make the price of occupation more expensive than the benefits of exploitation, ultimately the occupier will leave. I think that's also the Hamas tactic, to use anti-colonial guerrilla tactics. The problem is we don't experience ourselves that way. And we respond to Hamas like an indigenous people with superior firepower that feels threatened. And something like BDS, boycotts, divestment, sanctions, are very effective when they're used against Western societies, especially against colonial societies like South Africa. But against societies that are not so Western, where the material well-being of the individual is not at the center, places like North Korea, places like Iran, maybe even Russia, BDS-type tactics aren't very effective. In fact, they create a lot of cohesion, shared sense of oppression, unity, resistance. And Israeli society is interesting because Israeli society, the ruling class up till now has been very westernized and has seen the West as its patron and has wanted to be connected to the West. I think one of the big obstacles to peace right now is the insistence of Israel's ruling class to be part of the West and not the Middle East. But the flip side to that is the insistence on much of the Middle East to see us as part of the West and not the Middle East. And BDS as a tactic actually weakens the most westernized sectors of Israeli society while strengthening the most traditionalist and tribalist sectors of Israeli society, people like me. And that, combined with the demographic trajectory, the birth rates in Israeli society, show me that people like me have already won. It's just a question where Palestinians sit in all that at this point. And if we can create a country that actually lives up to what I believe are my people's values and my people's ideals when it comes to the treatment of the other. And when it comes to creating a reality where people are happy and people are able to move forward feeling that they have, that they're invested in the country and that they want to be part of the country. So in terms of the power dynamics and normalization, I think that it's clear that right now at this moment in time and for a long time now already, the power dynamics have favored Israel. I'm not sure if we experience the same privilege that people are saying we're experiencing, but even if we have it, I'm not sure that we're conscious of the fact that we have it, especially with the house demolitions that take place and the way we psychologically experience those house demolitions. Only a few days ago, there was a Jewish village called Amunah that was completely destroyed. All the people were forced from their homes. And we can have a discussion over whose land that was and why they're displaced, but the reality they experienced was oppression.
You got something excellent in return, right? The passage of the law today.
I don't know what I got in return, but the 40 families who lived there, and the 200 children who lived there, their worlds were destroyed. That's a reality. So they don't feel privileged. And these are people who are living on the front lines of an ethnic conflict. They've experienced house demolitions, many of them have experienced police brutality, some of them have even experienced administrative detention and torture. And in my opinion, these Jews who have those experiences are the perfect candidates to lead our negotiations with the Palestinians.
So the assumption immediately that when you're criticizing the two-state solution, you're for a one-state solution. And I just want to make it very clear that I don't know if this is where I stand. As I said, at this point, no solution works because of all the issues we're discussing. And for me, the question is, what needs to happen? In a sense, what is the foundation that needs to be laid out for the right solution to be manifested? We're talking about the blueprints, we're talking about the maps, we're talking about the design of the house. I'm asking, what is that foundation that will sustain that drawing, whatever it is? And at this time I say, we don't have anything that can sustain this. What needs to happen to sustain this, in my opinion, is to begin to engage in what I would call a real struggle that moves from a Palestinian struggle to ending colonialism, a liberation movement, which is what I call a Gandhian struggle, which is what Gandhi was doing to liberate India from the British mandate, to a more civil rights, equal rights struggle, South Africa and the civil rights movement in the US. And so for me, I am fully for nonviolence, and a shift in the Palestinian struggle for nonviolence, in partnership, in participation, in cooperation with our Jewish friends and neighbors who begin to struggle for civil equal rights for all the people in this land. And this is where I actually say I am actually for BDS. I am a person who promotes BDS, and at the same time I am one of the biggest critics of the current BDS movement. For similar things to what Yehuda said, and for other things, and that can take a whole hour just to discuss this. But I think to say that yes, those who are engaging in oppression need to understand this. Those who are violating human rights, those who mistreat people, those who are racist, those who feel privileged over others, need to be resisted, need to be addressed, and nonviolence is the means to do this. I am a very big critic of violence, and I do not justify or excuse any violence done by anybody towards others, and especially by the Palestinians. Because for me that also feeds into the narrative of many Jews, which is the narrative of trauma, existential threat, and they're all coming to get us, and look at the Palestinians, they are the Nazis. All this narrative we hear in the Israeli media, and nonviolence for me becomes the tool to really address this and achieve, having a much bigger chance of achieving it. There isn't a magic stick for nonviolence, but it has a much more possibility of achieving results, and this is based on successful nonviolent activism around the world.
Thank you. And thank you all for your patience.
Wait, he has more?
Yeah.
I wanted to say just a few more things. Just when it comes to polls, I mean, I think we fully understand what polls mean to us, especially those who live in the U.S. and the results of polls and expectations. And so for me, I look into what we were saying earlier. When you believe this is the only narrative that you have, when you have been convinced this is the only thing available for you, this is what you will support, this is what you will engage in. But if you look within these polls and look into the youth margin, where are the Palestinian youth moving? 45% of Palestinian youth in the West Bank, a higher percentage in Gaza, have given up on the two-state solution. And if you really look into the polls that are taking place, actually, the first issue that concerns the average Palestinian is not the occupation. It's the current economic situation, the current social situation, the current internal political situation. These are actually the daily concerns of the average Palestinian now. And so we could look at different polls and get different results from this. But for me, the bottom line is, just like the story that you started with, if everybody believes the sun revolves around the earth, any person that comes out suggesting something different is absolutely crazy. And I would add and say that the Palestinian Authority itself, when you talk about who are supporting the two-state solution, I see the elite on both sides that are actually supporting the two-state solution more, and the Palestinian elite, especially the political elite, certain political parties that are benefiting from the status quo, not benefiting even from the establishment of the state, from the status quo, are the ones that are pushing within the Palestinian narrative. The two-state solution is the only answer, and any criticism of the two-state solution is a criticism of Palestinian nationalism and identity. And so this is a very big challenge for us as Palestinians who talk about rights, who our leaders are using the rhetoric of rights to really begin to challenge them and really ask our leadership, how do the refugees return to their homes in what you are presenting us? And they will always find a way to not answer this question for them. What we are trying to say, what I'm trying to say in my conversations with Yehuda and others, is we actually want to answer this question. We want to see how Palestinians return, not to the West Bank as a symbolic gesture of returning to the Palestinian state, but if they want to return to their villages and homes, destroyed in 1948, how do we do this? How do we achieve this? The last point I want to say is about normalization. If there's anything normal about this conversation, then this is anti-normalization. The normalization is accepting the normality of life of what's happened. 99% of the Palestinian and Israeli population are normalized, thinking what they're thinking that the way we're living now is what needs to happen. How do we just find a way to get along with what is going on? We are challenging normalization by beginning to have these conversations.
Okay, thank you very much. We have one mic to pass around. So we'll take questions and comments. The comments are going to be as brief as the questions, but I don't like to outlaw comments because we can react to a comment just as we can to a question.
I'm wondering what perhaps all four of your opinions are on what the role of university students are in America in solving this conflict.
We want to take additional questions.
No.
I'll forget his question.
Because then people can pick and choose what they're going to talk about.
That's true. Okay. I think that practically, one thing I didn't speak about is the work that people like me and Sami are doing practically. And one of the things that we're focusing on is facilitating dialogue sessions for people who are really the extremes on both sides. I think right now, just like the conflict in our country is extremely, I said, two narratives fighting past each other. I think that's also the situation on campuses with like Stand With Us or APAC, whoever, the Hasbara industry, and like SJP, BDS, JVP on the other side. They're really shouting past each other.
Can you speak a little bit more in detail about the role of the Jewish in the Jewish state you're proposing? You say soft, but what does it mean in terms of commerce on Saturday, in terms of marriage and divorce, etc.? So what role does Judaism has within your proposal? Yeah.
While we're waiting for you, Mike, would you want the temple to be rebuilt in this state?
Answer your question
Well,
again.
it's the calendar question. Let's say it's the calendar.
The calendar?
Yeah.
The Hebrew calendar. I would hold by the Hebrew calendar now.
Oh, I'm sorry, the microphone. Okay, I heard three questions, but I'm going to address the one that you said. I think that the truth is we don't know. And my problem is with the people who claim to know. I think what we essentially did when we defeated the British is we lowered their flag and we put our flag on the same system. We basically continued the mandate in many ways, but just with like Jewish decorations on it instead of British decorations on it. And I think we never went through a process of figuring out what is the kind of society, what is the kind of civilization that we came home to create. And I think we're afraid. I think many Israelis are afraid to have this conversation, like what we came back to unpack. I think what actually happened to us is when the Romans destroyed our civilization, we kind of shoved it into a box and took it with us. And essentially for maybe 1700 years, we were living all over the world as Palestinian refugees, living in ghettos, isolated from the host communities, organizing our communal life according to the kind of a portable version of the civilization we left behind. And ultimately, over time, especially in Europe, this became known as Judaism. But the Judaism is a modern social construct, to be honest. Like, you won't see the word Judaism in the Torah, you won't see it in the Gemara. It's a relatively recent social construct that was kind of created for Jews in the Enlightenment to define their identity. And what we did was we came home and we forced the British to leave, and we basically continued the mandate, but with Jewish decorations. And there's friction has existed between those who want like a Jewish state without understanding what that really means yet, and those who want a Western state, like basically an outpost of Western civilization in the Middle East, which I see as inherently colonialist. And I think when we talk about decolonizing Palestine or decolonizing Jewish identity, they actually go hand in hand. Because we need to get rid of the colonialist trappings of Zionism and of what Israeli society is today. And that means re-embracing our authentic Semitic identity. It's not a question of what role does the laws of the Torah have in the society, but how do we see ourselves fundamentally? And I think the real shift is not between religious and secular or right and left. I think those are actually foreign labels to us. I think it's about whether or not we see ourselves as Semites, as part of the broader Middle East, as an organic part of the region, or we want to be part of Western civilization, or as like Ehud Barak says, like a villa in the jungle. And I think that is like the fundamental conflict, the friction taking place in Israeli society today. You see it, I think, the two-staters, like the Israeli two-staters and what we call here, I guess, the liberal Zionists. One of the reasons I believe they're so obsessed with this two-state solution is because they see it as their last opportunity to protect this kind of like Western colony in the Middle East. And I'm not interested in a Western colony. I'm interested in a civilization that deeply expresses my people's values in its institutions and in its policies. And I don't think that's going to be a giant Haredi community, and I don't think it's going to be a Jewish Iran. I think it's going to be something that we haven't seen in a long, long time, and we have to figure it out together with the Palestinians.
Since I am a student, I want to ask a question. This is for Sami or Saya, as they were both. How do you respond to what Yehuda is saying, the vision he's laying out? Do you find it desirable, or is it problematic in some ways? How, if so? And if you think that it's desirable in some ways, then what political steps should people in the Palestine solidarity movement be taking differently than they currently are, or should they keep doing what they're doing to try to realize a different model? You know, so just questions like that. You also can, yes, of course.
VIP, very important Palestinian.
Yeah, I think one of the points of awakening for me listening to Yehuda in the past was when he talked about the shift of Jewish identity from Zionism to Semitism, and the return to our Semitic roots, which are nomadic Middle Eastern roots that fit into my narrative much more better, easily, and actually in a real understanding of equality and justice than the current ideology that many Israeli Jews experience. So for me, yes, I mean the details are very, very challenging. How is this lived out? And I would say yes, I'm listening to this and I'm listening to the debate and discussion, and this is going to be a very serious internal Jewish debate that needs to happen, that actually I am not part of. For me, I look into my identity. If it's a Christian identity, if it's a Muslim identity, if it's a secular Palestinian identity, and ask how is this manifested in a way where it is recognized, and my rights are recognized, and my freedom is recognized, and my right to express my beliefs are recognized and acknowledged and protected by whatever legal system that is created. And so for me, it is a big challenge. And to say, but the more important point is the once the Jewish Israeli population is freed from the mindset of colonialist, exclusivist, the most victimized, therefore the most entitled, and really begin to see how are we living, returning to our real roots, inherited roots of being. Yehuda talks about, the football, instead of, singing the Eurovision and playing football in Europe, it's about looking towards the Middle East. This is where the Jewish people needs to engage in. And I believe when this happens, there's going to be such an opening, such a welcoming, such an understanding, such an embrace of Judaism that I would say we haven't seen before, because of the narrative that we have lived for the last 60 years, which is Judaism is this colonialist approach. And so I really accept this narrative, and I see great potential in moving forward with this idea.
I'll say that some of it resonated, some of it challenges me as someone who's deeply committed to secular systems of governance. I'm biased as a gay person. I would like not to be stoned to death. So I have no desire to live under a Jewish state or a Christian state or an Islamic state or a Hindu state or whatever. That being said, if my cross is added on the flag alongside the Star of David, and if my Palestinian Muslim neighbor's crescent is also added to the flag, and the flag represents coexistence, and rainbow, that would be great too. Fabulous. I could find myself sort of flirting with the idea, so I guess I'm kind of, bi-curious, if bi-nationalist curious, in this way. So that's my answer. Just to go back to the student activism question, just very quickly, I appreciate that question. Given that we're at Penn, I would really encourage some of the folks at Penn to challenge the status quo at Penn and to think about how Penn is reproducing this asymmetry in power and the status quo. At your Hillel, this event would not be possible because Sami has spoken in favor of BDS. The Hillel policy is, I think, unacceptable, and it doesn't foster dialogue. And I'm very proud that Swarthmore, where I am, is the first open Hillel in the country. And Harvard, where I was as a student, had the first open Hillel conference. So I would encourage some of you to think about how to start an open Hillel campaign at Penn. And the second thought that comes to mind is about birthright at Penn. For those of you who support the Birthright Israel program, which allows any Jewish student to have a free trip to Israel, Palestine, I'd like you to think about your Palestinian classmates and the pain that they're experiencing because they're told that they don't have a birthright and that they're not allowed on this program because they're not Jewish. And to think about perhaps lobbying the program to expand so that Jewish people, as well as Palestinian Christians and Muslims, all Penn students with connections to that land, can participate in that program.
I just want to respond to the Semitic vision of going back to our Middle Eastern roots. So my family is from Morocco and Egypt, and I actually find this talk of, Semitic kind of authenticity a little Orientalist. That somehow, because we're from the Middle East, we're not able to deal with secular liberal democracy. We have to go back to some Jewish kind of Jewish state that's more Jewish, and we can't handle a modern nation state or secular liberal kind of democracy. That idea of Semitism sounded to me a little bit Orientalist. So if you didn't mean it in that way, maybe you can clarify that.
No, I think this is, first of all, I didn't say any of those things. I think anybody who heard them is hearing it with Orientalist ears, quite frankly. And we have an identity problem. And it affects almost everything about Israeli society today. Israel is a Middle Eastern country. Anybody who walks through any major city in Israel will see it is actually a Semitic country already. Socioculturally, etc., that's what we are. The problem is we have been force-fed this idea that we don't want to be, that we actually want to be part of the West. The West is superior. Their values are superior. I'm not talking about democracy. When I talk about democracy, democracy to me is empowering people to influence the systems and structures in their country. That is democracy to me. I don't think Israel is a democracy right now, and I don't think the United States is a democracy right now. The United States is a corporatocracy. Meaning at the end of the day, the corporations, I don't know, Trump might be an anomaly, but the corporations that fund political campaigns have a lot more influence over policies than the people who wake up to vote every 4 years. And I think we need to acknowledge the flaws that exist in the system and acknowledge specifically in relation to Israel and the Palestinians the flaws that are inherent in the colonial features of Zionism, in the colonialist features of the State of Israel. And part of that is this desire to be the Robin to America's Batman in the Middle East. Now, I didn't say anything about democracy or liberal democracy or Judaism being a law. In fact, I said Judaism is a social construct. I think that we have and again, I think that maybe I should clarify, when I talk about being Jewish, that's not a religion for me. That's my people. That's, I guess, another social construct, my ethnicity. I'm a Kohen. I know what tribe I'm from. I know what sub-tribe I'm from. When I wrap tefillin in the morning, it's not some religious act. I have a law to do it. It's something my ancestors have been doing for thousands of years, something that connects me to my identity. So again, I want to experience a country that I feel, that I experience as expressing the values of my people for thousands of years in our institutions and in our policies, but not in a way that's coercive, not in a way that makes somebody who has a different kind of identity than me feel like something is being forced on them, and certainly not in a way that makes Palestinians or others feel that there's something they're not getting or something that they don't have access to because they're not Jews like me.
Hi, I have two questions, and anyone can jump in. And the first has to do actually with Mizrahim in Israel. Growing up with Mizrahi family, I can say that I grew up hearing all sorts of vile things about Palestinians and Arabs. My family, despite the fact that they are Arab Jews, will claim that they are non-Arab, and will make statements such as, "Oh, so-and-so in the family looks like such an Arab," and so forth. So my first question is, what do you do with those groups of people who have been marginalized and at the same time have been manipulated to hate their own brothers and sisters in a lot of ways? And then my other question actually pertains to, what do you do about the settlements that are built on stolen land? With all due respect, Amona was built on Palestinian land that was owned by Palestinians. So what do you do in that situation? Would you have more evacuations? How do you deal with right of return in those situations, rather, is my question.
Well, the first question on the Mizrahi side.
You gotta speak louder into the mic.
I just, some of the water went down. No, I mean, I think, first of all, what's your name? Marissa, I think that we are coming from very different paradigms, even in terms of the way you define Mizrahim as Arab Jews. I would take issue with that. I think that Mizrahim are Jewish by ethnicity. They were living in Arab countries, but their group, the tribe they belonged to, in Arab countries, they identified as Jews, and they were identified as Jews, just like Ashkenazim in European countries identified as Jews and were identified as Jews. So I don't agree with your the way you're identifying Mizrahim as Arab Jews. I find that problematic. But at the same time, I think you're correct that we need to start looking at the other differently, and I think that comes from changing the role the other plays in our story. In terms of land, like Amonah, for example, I think the real truth behind everything else is that property rights has been politicized. It's not about property rights. Meaning both sides are using property rights and land ownership to try and push their agenda, but there is another agenda behind that claim of property rights. And as I said before, from our perspective, it's an issue of trying to resist people trying to separate us from our land. our government, the Netanyahu government, hasn't created, hasn't allowed us to even build new homes in existing communities, like even where kids grow up, etc., they get married, they can't move into the same community. We see the world trying to not just stop us from growing, but to uproot us completely, and stopping us from growing is like a first step in trying to uproot us. Therefore, we take what we can, without thinking about who might own what, and without getting into the fact that property rights have been politicized, especially in from 2005 on, they've been politicized, just like demography has been politicized, just like archaeology has been politicized, just like so much has been politicized in our conflict. And I think the answer is to acknowledge that this is taking place, that there are other motivations behind what each side is doing, and to stop playing this game where like it's really an attempt by certain forces to get Jews out of the West Bank, and then there's and the way to do that, in my opinion, is first of all, if there's a situation where Palestinians do own the land, and like let's say Amona, there should be direct negotiations between the Jews living in Amona and those Palestinians. If it were up to me, I would be able to live in Beit Lechem, Sami would be able to live in Beit El, and Amona could be a mixed community. But if there's a situation where you already have families living somewhere and somebody else owns the land, and we know that the army will likely not let them access that land under the current conditions, then I would actually support financial compensation as an answer, and not to destroy anybody's home.
I'm not going to run around.
Thank you. So I guess my question is to both of the activists at the table, but I'm happy for anyone else to answer too. I was disturbed by Rabbi Cohen's sentence that he said, "We managed to come back to our land after 2,000 years. I don't know how we got here." You owe a great debt to the Zionist movement, not as the religious Zionist settler movement, but to the Zionist movement that obtained diplomatic promises from the English and from the United Nations to have 2 states in Palestine. And the wiping out of that fact in your story was really difficult for me to hear, because it's as though the Jews for 2,000 years waited for the land. We got here somehow, and we're Semites, we're not Europeans. Now, European Jews were the ones who got the promise to get for the land on a European paradigm of what a state is, for a 2-state solution, which is a Westphalian model which comes from the United Nations. And that's part of why we need to rethink this whole situation, because it comes from somewhere else. And now here we are on this land, and we're not sure the Westphalian model is quite right for these people, and particularly for people who have, who care about the land and living on the land more than they care about necessarily owning the land. And I really appreciated Sami's comments about really the connection that people have to land, and let's start from there. But there's also another dimension. I think that we have to go back to the fact that I'm not sure that that there's a large enough portion of Israeli society represented here. I think that Leahy is voicing this sort of more liberal Israeli Jew who really just wants peace, but who isn't represented by this narrative of finally after 2,000 years we've arrived at the land, and it's what we pray for 3 times a day, namely the Messiah. And I think this is where the question about the temple is coming in. So I'd be interested in hearing how these things fit together and whether they can fit together.
As a moderator, I just want to say one thing. By no stretch of the imagination was this now ever imagined to be representative. So let's start.
I was afraid I shut it off. First of all, I acknowledge, and I'm sorry if I wasn't clear enough for you, that through this movement called Zionism, the Jewish people did achieve a great deal. My problem is that it did have colonialist trappings, I think Zionism is interesting, just like I said before, different narratives. You can take different facts and come to different conclusions based on how you contextualize those facts. So you could look at Zionism as a liberation movement of a people that's actually from that land, and you have true facts to support that claim. And you can also look at Zionism as a colonial project, and you have real facts to support that claim. I, at this point in history, believe that now that we're post-Zionist, because although I share your appreciation for Zionism and I think it succeeded, I think it did make a mess, it did have flaws, and now we have to correct those flaws. That's where we're at now. So I would like to focus on the indigenous people's liberation movement aspect of Zionism while trying to decolonize the colonial structures and features of it. I don't agree with you that we have a state because of the British or the UN. I think the British were advancing British interests in the Middle East, and I think they created a lot of problems, just like I think the United States today advances American interests in the Middle East and isn't really pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli. I think that we each, many Israelis where I live tend to see the Americans as pro-Palestinians, and many Palestinians I know tend to see the Americans as pro-Israel. And the truth is, America's pro-America, just like the British are pro-British. I also don't accept this narrative that the UN gave us a state or created a two-state solution. It was a General Assembly resolution. It had no teeth. It was a recommendation in its own language. It was rejected not only by Arabs, but also by the Jews who actually successfully fought to free the country from the British. And I think this idea that we have a state because of UN General Assembly Resolution 181 was really only promoted in Israeli society to legitimize the rule of Mapai, because you would think that if the Lehi and the Etzel succeeded in freeing the country from the British, maybe Nathaniel and Moore or Menachem Begin should be prime minister. So I think UN General Assembly Resolution 181, this partition plan, was a good way for Ben-Gurion and the Mapai Party to push this narrative that they're responsible for establishing the state. And I think the psychological ramifications of it have been that the way to maintain some kind of state is to appease the international community and not to be willing to fight for it.
I just want to very quickly to this. For me, as a Palestinian, this is not a challenge. And that's clearly a Jewish debate. But I want to say, for me, the question is, how am I being able to live my life? How am I attaining my freedom in the context of what is being experienced, especially inside Israel itself, and that debate within Israel itself. And I want to admit something that I think is going to be challenging to many people. One of the biggest challenges that I face now in the work that we're doing is what is referred to as the liberal Zionist left in Israel. I see them actually an obstacle to achieving peace more than anything. And I see the reason for this is because they are motivated by this idea, this concept of maintaining a demographic Jewish majority no matter what, and in this lack of understanding what does that mean to even have a Jewish majority, and what is the definition of Jewish majority, especially coming from a secular understanding of Judaism, which is, you know the joke, you ask 10 Jews what is Judaism, you get 12 answers. And so for me, this becomes a challenge for me to understand what does that mean to me. And what it means to me, in a very general way, is that we have the right to this land. We have exclusivity to this land. We want to offer you something that allows us to maintain our majority. And by giving you this token state, which in reality, as we know very well, is about just self-rule and autonomy, and you cover the costs, and you could wave your little flag and sing your national anthem, and every 20 years elect somebody, and if we like them, we'll keep them. If we don't, we'll make sure we get rid of them. We'll maintain overall control. But the whole concept is, how do we maintain a demographic majority? And for me, this is a challenge. And I think Yehuda has presented it in previous conversations very well, that it is a challenge that needs to be addressed, not fulfilled. So for me, to look into the concept of a Jewish majority, and to begin to ask, why is this real need to have a Jewish majority in this land? Why is this need for exclusivity in this land? And to begin to address these issues instead of just accepting it. And I think the Palestinian Authority failed, the PLO failed, by simply accepting this, oh yeah, you need to have a Jewish majority. I want to challenge this. And I think Yehuda challenges this very well, and many others are challenging this very well, asking, what does it mean to live in equal rights and civil rights? The values that the American Jewish population has struggled for and fought for and stood with the African American community for years in defending, they are the ones that are not fighting for my rights in Palestine to achieve, in the whole land to achieve. And so this goes back to the question of what do we do in campuses? I want American Jews in university campuses in the US to fight for the right of refugees to return, for civil rights of all Palestinians in the land to be fully present, and the freedom for me to practice my faith or lack of faith in any corner of the land itself. When I see Jews around the world adhering to the values that they have been standing for 2,000 years, and not excluding the Palestinians out of these values, this I think will begin to create the transformation.
I'd like to ask a question, but I'd like to actually give you a choice. There's two questions. You can answer the one you want, the two actors. So one of the questions is, point to a country that has existed sometime in history, or exists now, that for you is sort of like what you have in mind. Or you could say, there never has been anything like what I want. But if that's one question, you can answer that. If you don't want to answer that question, then here's another one.
You have to answer that.
No, here's another one. It's like, it is in the state of affairs that you look forward to. Will, Yehuda, you imagine that the vast number of Palestinian refugees in Gaza, whose homes are just across the line in the northern Negev, where there are very few Jews living, that they'll be able to return to that area in this future state? And would you imagine, Sami, that in the future polity that you're imagining, that Jews from Argentina and France and the United States will be able to move into the West Bank? So choose your question.
I'll take the second question. I like that one more. Well, your first question is, I don't think there has been, we're creating something new. That's a simple answer. Second question is, yes, absolutely. I think the Palestinians living in Gaza should absolutely have not only the freedom to expand into the Negev, but I would even support, as part of some redistribution of wealth and resources, financial incentives for Palestinians who want to migrate from Gaza, like into the Negev, and participate in what's taking place right now in the Negev. Of course, I'd also like to see the rebuilding of Gush Katif and the Jewish communities that were destroyed in the Gaza region.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say for the first one, there is a paradigm shift in creativity that needs to happen. And I think when we get to that point, this is what we need to engage in. So it's not about a Western style or an Eastern style, a Middle Eastern style. It's not about democracy. It's a whole new system that has to evolve, that has to be uniquely adapted to the context of what we are experiencing and living in the Holy Land. That includes the secular, includes the religious, the LGBTQ community, those who don't want to practice faith, those who are engaging, to really begin to understand what does it really mean to live in what we create as, even using the word democracy, I don't even want to use that, whatever we create. And then for the second question, I say yes. I mean, for me it was a shock a few years ago when I learned, for example, that 80% of Jewish historic religious sites exist in the West Bank. I did not know this because until that point it was politically motivated. It was about liberation movement, it's about colonialism, it's about this is ours, this is theirs, we need to get rid of them. And then for me, when I began to realize 80% of Jewish historic sites exist in the West Bank, I began to ask, where are my historic religious sites? And I actually began to understand and realize that 80% of my religious historic sites are on the other side of the Green Line. As a Christian. And I've been bought into this argument that Bethlehem is where it happened, and Bethlehem is yours, and Bethlehem is the Palestinian Christian community. And there's sort of this block from Nazareth, from the Galilee, and especially from Jerusalem, as a religious site of my ancestors, of my faith. And then, of course, for me it's not about denying, but it's about how do we make this as an equal right for everybody. A Jew wants to return, he has the right to return, just like a Palestinian wants to return, has the right to return. And instead of saying, I don't want the settlers in the West Bank, for me to ask, how am I How am I getting Yehuda's support to get my rights to Jaffa, where my ancestors come from?
A couple more questions?
Is there any woman who would like to answer this question? Okay, there,
A quick and simple question for the academics on the panel, the two academics on the panel. I'd love to hear from you two each something surprising that you heard this evening that was new to you, and or something that you would like to refute that you feel is problematic.
I don't know if it's surprising, but I think it's the lack of concreteness, and maybe that's my lack of creativity, imagination. And I think maybe that's the difference between activists who are going to change the world and academics who see the world and interpret it and comment on it. You know, there's realism, and then there is, you know, visionaries. So I think I love that, but I want, as someone who is connected to empirical reality, I want more details about, you know, how this is achievable, especially because most Israelis and not most Palestinians are not with you guys yet. I wish they were with you guys. They're not with you guys. How do you bring them on board? so how do you bring them on board? I love the idea of moving to a paradigm of civil rights. And I think that whether you believe in a one-state or a two-state, that is a good strategy for Palestinians, because it might get them a one-state, or it might get them a two-state. It might get them a Palestinian state, because all the Zionists will freak out about you know, the demographic issues and civil rights, and they will say, okay, let them have a state. So I guess I'm not refuting anything. I'm just inspired by the creativity, and it, you know, forces me to move beyond reality to a future that is very, very, very different. So that's inspiring. So thank you both for that.
Thanks. I think this panel is incredibly important because it highlights the fact that most Israelis and most Palestinians can't actually be put in boxes. You know, those of us who study the conflict or teach the conflict, we're used to sort of breaking it down. There's this camp, and there's this camp, and there's this camp, and they think this, and they think that, and we can neatly put people. But I think what Rabbi Yehuda and Sami both represent is that most Israelis and Palestinians think in very creative, unorthodox ways, have all kinds of views, have positions on different policy issues that are contradictory sometimes, that are different than others. And so I think it's really, I wish more people could hear these voices, because I think they actually represent a broader range of voices than we often realize.
I can't believe that I've followed this issue since 1945 at least. And this third group here in this row represents a group here in Philadelphia called Christian Jewish Allies. And I have, ever since I read Edward Said's book, to me, it seems the only way to address this issue. And what I see happening here tonight is the beginning of this. I'm an architect, and I know that any project begins with entertaining an idea and trying to find a creative solution to a problem that exists. And this is the beginning of it. And it just encourages me tremendously, and I thank you all. There's one thing. One thing that we haven't just ended this discussion is how do we address the United States military industrial involvement in this? This is, I don't know that anybody would have an answer, but it must be addressed.
To the end.
I really appreciated, Yehuda, how when you described the narrative that you're living under, you acknowledged that it might not be based on fact, and in a sense it doesn't matter because it's how it's perceived. And I would highly recommend Daniel Boyarin's book, Traveling Homeland, for an alternative understanding of whether the Jews as indigenous to Israel, as inheritors of a sovereign country, whereas Boyarin has an image, he points to the Talmud, where the Talmud sees Babylon as center and Palestine as of a lower class, and he's kind of given us an understanding of Jewish identity as one that inherently travels. And so, and a sense of indigenousness to Judea and Samaria would be kind of alien to his analysis. But I also, and I really see that your experience, even though you rebel against Western Zionism and don't agree in a sense with its values, but your experience in a sense, at least historically, is wholly a product of Western European Zionism. But I do really value the fact that many people have currently, real live people, understand their situation differently, and that needs to be taken into account. Just to clarify one thing, you unequivocally both rejected U.S. military participation. You unequivocally said that Gazans could move anywhere in the land. I haven't heard you explicitly talk about Palestinian refugees from the Palestinian diaspora. Is your approach to welcome them to the land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan?
Looking right at you.
You want to answer it for you?
Yeah.
First of all, let me answer your last question first. I think we absolutely have to have a conversation about the Palestinian refugees. In my experience, that's much more central to Palestinians than a state or a flag. And for me, it's not, I think the idea of the refugees is not a negation of my people's history or aspirations the way a two-state solution would be. I relate to the idea of relinquishing the parts of my homeland, especially the cradle of Jewish civilization, the West Bank, as a negation of my people's identity, as a negation, as a betrayal of our aspirations for thousands of years. I think there are many Israelis who fear the conversation about refugees because of the potential ramifications of how that might be implemented. But for me, there's nothing about the notion of a Palestinian refugee currently living in Syria or Jordan coming back to Yafo or Akko or Tzvat that threatens me, that negates my people's story, that betrays my people's history or aspirations. So I think it's a conversation we need to have. In terms of implementation, it will be a complicated conversation because implementation would have to take place in such a way that doesn't make people feel so threatened. In terms of your other statement, I once decided, because I assumed there was something powerful being said, intelligent being said that might challenge me. I watched a video of Shlomo Zand, who wrote this book, The Myth of, what was it called? The Myth of the Invention of the Jewish People. And I have to be honest, as somebody who knows a little bit about his own people's history, I just found his argument to be ridiculous. I don't think it was even worth refuting. And it just came from my experience was it just came from a total ignorance of his own people's story. And one thing people don't know, and many young Jews don't learn, even in the most Jewish of educational frameworks, is that between Bar Kokhba, between the fall of the Bar Kokhba revolt and Herzl's Zionism, there was at least a dozen Jewish liberation movements that struggled to restore Jewish independence to Palestine. We don't learn about them partially because they all failed, but if anybody's interested, I can list them later. I think that all of those liberation movements were driven by a specific vision that I share. I think that some of the Zionists there were so many different streams of Zionism, but some of the Zionists were driven by that vision. Ironically, well, maybe not ironically, probably fittingly, the less colonial-minded or the less westernized Zionists were driven by this vision. So I think that vision is consistent. This vision that transcends from Bar Kokhba all the way through those liberation movements, all the way to today, has been consistent, and a lot of Zionism was just kind of colonial tools and a colonial exterior shell that can now be discarded.